Good morning, brothers and sisters. Happy Easter to you. I invite you to open your Bibles to Matthew chapter 1. We're going to conclude our examination today of Matthew 1, 18 to 25. And if you have your class book with you, we're on page 14 of your class book. I forgot to ask this last week. Does anybody need a book? We have extras. Anyone come in here and maybe never got a book or wants one? Just raise your hand and let me know. We have plenty of books left. But page 14 in your class book. Last week, we discussed the four big ideas that I would argue, the four big ideas of Matthew 1, 18 to 25. That this first narrative scene in the Gospel of Matthew is all about Jesus' identity and mission. That's what Matthew is communicating to us. What is Jesus' identity and mission? That's what chapter 1, verses 18 to 25 is communicating. And under that big umbrella theme, the four big ideas that we discussed are that in these verses of Matthew 1, 18 to 25, Matthew tells us that Jesus is the Son of God. He introduces that concept to us, which he'll then flesh out more in chapter 2. He also, again, hits us with the theme of Jesus being the Son of David by emphasizing Joseph's Davidic lineage. He also presents Jesus as a Savior. In fact, we're told in 1, 18 to 25 why the Messiah is even given the name Jesus, which means Yahweh saves. He's given that name because it speaks to his mission that he will save his people from their sins. And then finally, we're told that Jesus is Emmanuel, God with us. And Matthew will quote Isaiah 7:14 to make that point. That's going to be primarily where we spend our time today. Now, we could move on at this point. At this point, we could move on. We've already gotten a lot, because last week we also discussed some details that are in chapter 1, verses 18 to 25, things about Joseph. We could move on and have gotten a lot out of this small portion of text. But to do so would be doing a disservice to both Matthew and his presentation of Jesus. Because here in this section, he introduces us to a major element of his Christology. That is, his presentation of who Jesus is. And it has to do with Jesus being the fulfillment of the Hebrew Scriptures. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to continue to meet three of our class objectives. These three. I wanted at the end of this class for you to be able to explain Matthew's major themes that he introduces in 1:1 to 4:17, because that's the portion of Matthew's gospel that we're studying here. I also wanted you to be able to describe Matthew's claims about Jesus. What is his Christology? And we've already gotten a wealth of ideas about themes and claims that Matthew's making just in these first 25 verses. And we'll continue to look at that today. And then finally, I wanted you to be able to interpret Matthew's gospel in light of the larger biblical narrative. Because remember, when Matthew starts his gospel by saying the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham, he's cluing us into the fact that this story does not exist in a vacuum. This is the climax to the story of Israel. And so as you read Matthew's gospel, if we really want to get all the riches and depth of what Matthew is saying, we need to be reading it in light of all of the quotes and allusions and context from the Old Testament that Matthew is baking into his narrative so that we can understand how this Jesus of Nazareth serves as the climax to the story of Israel, and then what that means for humanity. So those are the three objectives that we're going to, again, meet today. So let's go ahead and get into it. At the top of your book at page 14, whenever we study a portion of Matthew's text, usually we'll have a section on literary features. Because Matthew is writing in the form of a narrative, and so he uses literary features to help contribute meaning to what he's getting across about Jesus. And so we're only going to speak about one in this portion of text. But here it is. Here will be the first blanks to fill out at the top of page 14. Here's the literary feature that I want us to focus on. The concept of God with us bookends Matthew's narrative. The concept of God with us bookends Matthew's narrative. And I talked about this last year in my class on literary features of the Gospels. And this isn't just true of the Gospels, this is true of a lot of biblical narrative, as well as even in the Psalms, poetry, where the biblical author will start a section with a certain quote or idea or theme, and then he'll end the section with the same quote, idea, or theme. And so he creates these bookends. Matthew does that with his entire narrative. In the first narrative section, chapter 1, verses 18 to 25, he introduces us to this idea of God with us. But look how he ends his gospel. Go to Matthew 28. And let's see this for ourselves in the text. Look at Matthew 28. So at the beginning of the narrative, we have this concept, God with us. But then at the very end of the narrative presentation of Jesus, look at what Matthew does. Look at Matthew 28 and start reading with me in verse 20, even though it's the middle of a sentence here. But teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you, and behold, I am with you always, to the end of the age. In other words, Matthew has bookended his gospel with this concept of God with us. So that if you look in the chart in your book on page 14, and I've kind of demonstrated this somewhat visually, everything in between those bookends are actions of God with us. So when you see in the narrative Jesus healing sicknesses, healing deformities, casting out demons, forgiving sins, raising the dead, all of that is to be understood in the bracket of this is God with us. This is what it means for God to be among humanity. However, there's an important development, or I should say two. There's two important developments in the bookend, because notice that while Matthew starts his narrative with God with us, he doesn't end his narrative by saying, and behold, God is with us until the end of the age. There's a difference. What's the development? At the end, who is it who is with his people at the end? Jesus. So note the development that Matthew has just performed. He has given us the bookend of God with us, but by the end of the narrative, the concept of God with us is mediated through the continued presence of the resurrected Jesus. In other words, Jesus the man is given the same omnipresence as God himself. How can Jesus, a man, be with his disciples to the end of the age? That would make him eternal. Yes, it would. That would make him omnipresent like God. Yes, it would. Because he is God with us. And so there's this development in the narrative. Yeah, Mr. Robert? Yes. Yes. The power of today, Easter, in that the resurrected Christ is now the means by which God is with us. And it's an incredible encouragement to the church. God is with us through the continued presence of the resurrected Christ. And then note the other development in the narrative. So even though we have this bookend, there's a second development. When God said, or when the concept of God with us was quoted in Isaiah 7:14, who was the community to whom God was with? In the context of Isaiah, who is God with? Israel. Yeah, the ethnic nation of Israel. But then look again at the end of the gospel and note who the community is whom God is with now. Look at Matthew 28 and look at verse 19. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you, and behold, I am with you, even to the end of the age. In other words, another development of Matthew's narrative is that the community who enjoys the presence of God is no longer defined by ethnic lines. Now, the community who enjoy God's presence are those who have a relationship with the resurrected Jesus of Nazareth. They are the ones who enjoy the presence of God, mediated to them through Jesus. And so you have that second development. So even though it is a bookend, there are developments to it that we need to understand. So as you read Matthew's gospel, you're going to read about that development. How did God's people go from ethnic Israel to all nations? Well, Matthew's gospel will develop that. How could Jesus, a human being, be given the same omnipresence and eternal nature as God? Well, Matthew's gospel will develop that. He's God with us. What questions or thoughts do you have on this literary feature that I wanted to point out? And because again, Matthew is a literary artist here. Matthew will continually use literary features like this to add richness and color and meaning to his gospel presentation, his narrative presentation of Jesus. And that's why I want us to note them, because it adds just further richness to our understanding of what he's saying about Jesus. What questions or thoughts do you have about this literary feature? Well, let's move on to our next section. Here's where we're going to spend the bulk of our time. We're always going to have a section where after we've examined a portion of Matthew's text, we're going to purposefully stop to examine how does Matthew use the Old Testament and what Christological claims is he making? In other words, what claims is he making about who Jesus is? One of them I've already alluded to, that he's God with us. That's part of Matthew's Christology. Usually we'll look at the Old Testament usage first, but today I want to flip it. So I want to give us two Christological claims that Matthew makes in this section, and then the second one will launch us into examining how Matthew uses Isaiah 7. And we'll spend the bulk of our time there. But here's the first one. One of the Christological claims that Matthew makes here is that Matthew ascribes to Jesus only things God can do. Matthew ascribes to Jesus only things God can do. Go back to Matthew 1. Matthew will do this repeatedly in the gospel. Repeatedly. He'll start it here, but he will then do this repeatedly throughout his narrative. Look at Matthew 1. And look at verse 21. She will bear a son, and you shall call his name Jesus, Yahweh saves. For he will save his people from their sins. Now, it's easy for us to maybe read that and just think, oh yeah, that's right. But I want you to think about this from the perspective of Judaism. In the Old Testament worldview, who is the one who forgives sins, who saves from sins? God. Let me give you two passages on the screen. There's a wealth we could look at. Let me just give you two. Look at this passage from Psalm 79, verse 9. Help us, O God of our salvation, for the glory of your name. Deliver us and atone for our sins for your name's sake. In the worldview of the Hebrew Scriptures, who delivers from sin? God. Look at the second one. Just give you one more. Psalm 130, verses 7 and 8. O Israel, hope in Yahweh. For with Yahweh there is steadfast love, and with him is plentiful redemption, and he will redeem Israel from all his iniquities. Now, if you were a Jew raised on these scriptures, and it's just common knowledge, yeah, God saves from sins, not the king, not the priest. They're just human beings like we are. The one who saves from sins is God. And then you have Matthew telling us that God says of this human being, he will save his people from their sins. Do you see how that would just cause some cognitive dissonance? Like, wait a second, wait. But this is a human being. How is he going to save people from their sins? Only God can do that. To which Matthew would reply, what he replies 2 verses later, that's right. Jesus is God with us. Well, how does that work? Matthew doesn't go into explaining it. He just says, well, this is who Jesus is. He's God with us. So he can deliver us from sins. But I thought Jesus was a human being. He is. But he's also God? Yes. This is part of Matthew's Christology. And so what I want us to see here is that we're seeing already in the narrative, you're going to see this again and again and again in Matthew, that Jesus will say things or do things that only God can do. Or people will react to Jesus the way they should be reacting to God, and yet it's not blasphemous. Jesus accepts worship from people. And it's all part of Matthew's Christology. Miss Arlene, was your hand up? Did I see it go up? Yes, ma'am. Go ahead. That's right. That's right. Yes. Yes. No. Yeah. We can't comprehend it. Yeah, Miss Charlene just pointed out, you have this concept of the Trinity. You have God the Father, God the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and we can't really wrap our minds around that. But then, we're also talking about Jesus being a human being as well. How do we put all this together? And ultimately, I would say our minds can't. God is above what we're able to comprehend. And so we just have to, we just have to accept it. Again, Matthew doesn't say, now let me explain to you in a theological treatise how God can be both man and human. He doesn't go into it. He just says, this is the truth. Just accept it or don't. Basically, is what he is presenting to us. And so those who have the eyes of faith just see it in Jesus and they accept it, even if we don't fully understand how all that works. Any other thoughts or questions on this part of Matthew's Christology? Having Jesus do things only God can do. Well, here's the second one, and this will launch us into examining Isaiah. Here we have Matthew introducing us to this part of his Christology, his presentation of Jesus, where he is presenting Jesus as the fulfillment of the Hebrew Scriptures. This is a very important theme in Matthew. Very important theme. Matthew will highlight this element of Jesus as the fulfillment of the Hebrew Scriptures. Matthew arguably does this more than the other Gospels. At least more explicitly than the other Gospels. More often explicitly than the other Gospels. Let me illustrate this, what I mean. Look at Matthew 1, and let me just show you how Matthew just keeps hitting us with this to show you that this is obviously a very important thought for Matthew. So in Matthew 1, look at verse 22. All this took place to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet. Now look at chapter 2, verse 5. They told him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for so it is written by the prophet. Look at chapter 2, verse 15. This was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet. And then look at chapter 2, verse 17, just 2 verses later. Then was fulfilled what was spoken by the prophet Jeremiah. Now look at verse 23 of chapter 2. And he went and lived in a city called Nazareth, so that what was spoken by the prophets might be fulfilled. Look at chapter 3, verse 3. For this is he who was spoken of by the prophet Isaiah. And then finally look at chapter 4, verse 14. So that what was spoken by the prophet Isaiah might be fulfilled. Now what I wanted to do was just show you, look at Matthew is like the composer of an opera. You think of Matthew 1:1 to 4:17 as the overture. This is where Matthew is just going to present all of his themes, well, I guess maybe not all of them, but most of his themes in a concentrated form so that we get those themes, and then as the rest of the narrative goes, we see how he develops those. The same way a composer does in writing music. He's got the overture, here's the themes, now he'll develop them in the rest of the musical or opera or whatever the case may be. And so what I want us to see here is how important this theme is for Matthew, that he's hitting us with it over and over again in the overture. Just like he did Son of David, where he's just, hey, this is a story of kingship. David's kingship. Read the narrative that way. This is the story of the fulfillment of the Hebrew Scriptures. Read the narrative that way. And so he's hitting us with it over and over again. And that is why, because this is so important to Matthew, that is why I have chosen in this class to dedicate significant portions of time to going back and looking at those passages that Matthew says Jesus fulfilled. Because if you're like me, you get to those passages and you're just like, oh yeah, Jesus fulfilled it. All right, and then you just move on. You just keep reading. And if someone were to ask you, how does Jesus fulfill Isaiah 7:14 and its context? How does Jesus fulfill Hosea 11:1 and its context? If you're like me, before I started studying Matthew, I would have had no answer. I'd have been like, oh, I don't know. I've never really looked at that in any detail. I just kind of took it for granted. These are the fulfillment. But I was missing so much of what Matthew is presenting about Jesus. And so that's why in this class, we're not just going to read over it. We're going to take the time to go back and look and see, what is Matthew telling us when he says Jesus fulfilled this particular Old Testament passage? So let's start doing that. And this is why I have the slides a different design. And if you look in your book on page 15, I have that chart there. I wanted this material to stand out. And so what we're going to do in your book, I've got the two columns. On the left, we're going to put 3 points about what Isaiah 7:1 to 8:22 is talking about. What's the whole context of the passage that Matthew quotes from Isaiah 7:14? And then in the right column, we're going to put parallel points to show how Jesus is fulfilling all this, so that we can then have a much more three-dimensional view of how Jesus relates to the context of Isaiah 7 and 8 that Matthew draws upon. And let me say this too real quick before we start doing this. I want to keep emphasizing this. Remember that in Matthew's day, there are no chapter and verse divisions. So Matthew doesn't have the luxury of saying, go back and read Isaiah 7:1 to 8:22 and just think about all that in light of Jesus. He can't do that. There's no chapter and verse divisions. So often in the New Testament, when a New Testament author quotes an Old Testament passage, they're bringing the reader back to the entire context of that passage, not just the few individual lines that he's quoting. And so we're going to see that today, that Matthew has much more in his mind than just Isaiah 7:14. That whole context is something that he wants to draw our attention to. So let's start doing that. Go ahead and flip over to Isaiah 7. Go ahead and flip over there. Now we're going to start reading in Isaiah 7 verse 10. But let me set up the background of what's going on before we start reading. But go ahead and go to Isaiah 7 and just be ready to start in verse 10. Now, if you take a look at the screens up here, I want to give you the background of what's happening when we start reading in Isaiah 7 verse 10. Hopefully that's visible to you there. On that map on the screen, do you see at the top right the nation of Syria? Now that's different than Assyria, just to be clear. They're two different nations. So at the top right, you have the nation of Syria, the capital of which is Damascus. Well, what had happened in the time of Isaiah, during the reign of King Ahaz of Judah, the king of Syria, who reigns in Damascus, had made a pact with the king of the northern kingdom of Israel, the capital of which is Samaria. And their pact was, let's go to war against Judah, let's remove King Ahaz from the throne, and let's put a puppet ruler on there so that we can use Judah's army and all that. And so probably what it was for is to band together to fight Assyria. And of course, the capital of Judah is Jerusalem. So that's what's going on. So when we start reading now in Isaiah 7 verse 10, just know there's this threat to Judah. Syria and Israel have banded together and they're plotting to take over Judah and remove King Ahaz from the throne. That's what's going on. So now look at Isaiah 7 verse 10. Because God is going to send Isaiah to King Ahaz to tell him, you don't need to worry about that threat. It's not going to happen. So here's what happens in Isaiah. Start reading with me in verse 10 of Isaiah 7. Again, Yahweh spoke to King Ahaz. Ask a sign of Yahweh your God. Let it be as deep as Sheol or as high as heaven. But Ahaz said, I will not ask. I will not put Yahweh to the test. And Isaiah said, hear then, O house of David, is it too little for you to weary men, that you weary my God also? Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. He shall eat curds and honey when he knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good. For before the boy knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good, the land whose two kings you dread will be deserted. Yahweh will bring upon you and upon your people and upon your father's house such days as have not come since the day that Ephraim departed from Judah, the king of Assyria. Now let's stop there. Let's just stop there. What's happened here is God sends Isaiah to Ahaz and says, look, ask for a sign so that God can help you to feel confident in his deliverance. And Ahaz, with false piety, says, oh, no, I'm not going to put Lord to the test. To which then Isaiah just says in exasperation, are you going to weary God? Is it too little for you to weary man? You're going to weary God now with this false show of piety? Fine, God's just going to give you a sign. A child is going to be born to, in the ESV it says virgin. Your Bible might even say maiden, or maybe in the footnote it may say maiden, a young woman of marriageable age. She's going to have a child who's going to be named Emmanuel, God with us. And then look at verse 16 of chapter 7. Let me read this again. For before that boy, Emmanuel, before he knows how to refuse the evil and choose good, the land whose two kings you dread will be deserted. In other words, before this child is old enough to know right and wrong, Syria and Israel won't even exist anymore as a nation. So you don't need to worry about this threat. Now, in the verse after that, God then says, but I'm going to bring Assyria in judgment on you. And we'll see why. Like, wait a minute, Nathan, I thought this was a message of deliverance. But there's also judgment? Yes. We'll talk about that in just a second. So let's start filling out the left column. In the context of Isaiah 7, let's understand what this Emmanuel child is all about. So here it is. Here's the first thing I'd put in the left column. We're told that a young maiden, a young woman of marriageable age, who would then also be a virgin, will conceive a child and name him God with us. That's the first point. Let's just establish that. So in the context of Isaiah 7, Isaiah says a woman is going to have a child, name him Emmanuel, and before he's old enough to know right from wrong, Syria and Israel won't even exist anymore. God's going to deliver you from that threat. Now, the reason that I've put on the screen a young maiden, and I didn't say a young virgin, is because I want to highlight how Jesus is a greater recapitulation of this pattern. In other words, what we're going to see with Jesus is that these events that happened in Isaiah's day are repeated in Jesus, but in a much greater way. And I want to draw our attention to that. And that's why I've said here a young maiden, because what Isaiah is talking about is just the normal sexual process. In fact, I think a good case can be made, which we're going to look at in just a moment, that Isaiah is talking about his own son that he's going to have with his wife. And that's who this Emmanuel child is, which we'll see in just a second. But regardless of who the child is, the child's going to come about through the normal sexual process. And then this child will be a sign. Before the child is old enough to know right from wrong, Syria and Israel will be gone. We'll come back to that point. But here's what's clear about this Emmanuel child. I know this is a little wordy on the screen. I couldn't think of a way to summarize this better. But here's what the child signifies in Isaiah's context. The child Emmanuel will serve as a sign to Judah of God's deliverance from the threat of Syria and Israel, and the threat of all nations. The child will serve as a sign to Judah of God's deliverance from the threat of Syria and Israel, and the threat of all nations. Now we've seen how this child is a sign of Judah's deliverance from Syria and Israel, from chapter 7, verse 16. Before the child knows right from wrong, they're going to be gone. Syria and Israel will be gone. But where am I getting this at the end after the comma, and all nations? Where's that coming from? Flip a page to Isaiah 8, because this is the context of the Emmanuel concept, the Emmanuel child, who is referenced again in chapter 8. Look at Isaiah 8, and just look at verses 9 and 10. We're going to go out of order a little bit here, but look at verses 9 and 10 of Isaiah 8. Be broken, you peoples, and be shattered. Give ear, all you far countries. Strap on your armor and be shattered. Strap on your armor and be shattered. Take counsel together and it will come to nothing. Speak a word, but it will not stand, for God is with us. Emmanuel. So here that concept Emmanuel comes out again, but notice in Isaiah 8, 9, and 10, the camera has zoomed out. And so now what Isaiah is saying is, Emmanuel is not just a sign that God's people will be delivered from Syria and Israel. Emmanuel is a sign that God's people will be delivered from all threats, all nations that would dare stand against God's people. They will not have victory, because God is with us. God is with His people. So the camera zooms out in Isaiah 8, and now it's looking at a much wider deliverance that this Emmanuel child and concept signifies. Okay, let me stop there. What questions or thoughts do you have thus far on what this Emmanuel child is a sign of in the context of Isaiah 7 and 8? Let me know where I've been unclear. If you're not familiar with Isaiah, some of this may be very new to you, and so you're kind of like, I'm not fully understanding. What questions or thoughts do you have on Emmanuel in Isaiah 7 and 8 as it pertains to him, this child being a sign of God's deliverance? All right, there's one more point we're going to put in the left-hand column. I mentioned earlier, we were reading Isaiah 7, you saw that, wait a minute, there's judgment here too, because God says He's going to bring Assyria to subjugate Judah. So, well, is it deliverance or is it judgment that Emmanuel is a sign for? It's both in the context of Isaiah. Look with me at Isaiah 8, And we're going to start reading in verse 3. And I went to the prophetess, and she conceived and bore a son. Then Yahweh said to me, call his name, the spoil speeds, the prey hastens. That's what that name means. The spoil speeds and the prey hastens. For before the boy knows how to cry, my mother or my father, the wealth of Damascus and the spoil of Samaria will be carried away before the king of Assyria. So thus far, the same message. And this is why I said I think most likely the child Emmanuel is Isaiah's own son, because the same thing is said of Isaiah's son that's said about Emmanuel. Before the child knows right from wrong, Syria and Israel are going to be gone. But does King Ahaz accept that message? Does King Ahaz and the rest of Judah, do they put their trust in God and say, okay, well then God, He is our deliverer. Let's put our faith in Him. No. Keep reading in the next verse of Isaiah. Look at chapter 8, verse 5. Yahweh spoke to me again. Because this people has refused the waters of Shiloah that flow gently, and rejoice over Rezin and the son of Remaliah. Therefore, behold, the Lord is bringing up against them the waters of the river, mighty and many, the king of Assyria and all his glory. And it will rise over all its channels and go over all its banks, and it will sweep on into Judah. It will overflow and pass on, reaching even to the neck. And its outspread wings will fill the breadth of your land. Now, the book of Kings gives us background here. So it fills in some of the gaps. If you're like, I'm not sure what's going on. Rezin, the son of Remaliah, is the king of Syria. So here's what happens. God had said to Judah, don't fear. Israel and Syria are going to be gone in a few years. This child is a sign of that. Before the child knows right from wrong, they're going to be gone. They're not even going to be a threat to you. And what Judah and Ahaz do is they reject God's message from Isaiah, and Ahaz goes to the king of Assyria and says, will you please save me from Syria and Israel, and I will be your servant. And so then what God is saying in Isaiah 8, when He says, because they rejoice over Rezin, Assyria came and took away the nation of Syria, and Ahaz's response was not, oh, what a great deliverance God has brought to us. His response was, oh, king of Assyria, you are so mighty, and we are your servants. And so God then says in Isaiah 8, 5-8, He speaks of Himself metaphorically as the waters of Shiloah that flow gently. And so God says, fine, you don't want the gentle waters of my kingship? You'd rather have Assyria? I will give you Assyria and their kingship in all of its cruelty. And you will have Assyria as your king, your ruler. And it goes terribly, as you know, for Judah. They're subjugated and overwhelmed. And so notice in Isaiah 8, verse 8, Emmanuel comes back in. The wings of Assyria will fill the breadth of your land, O God with us. So do you see that in Isaiah 7 and 8, the concept of God with us is a concept of deliverance, but it is also a sign of judgment, because God with us is a sign of what Judah and Ahaz rejected. They didn't want Yahweh as their king. They wanted deliverance from Assyria, and so God says, fine, you don't want me, I'll give you Assyria. And they're going to fill all your land. And so God with us is also going to be a sign of what Judah and Ahaz rejected and the judgment that they incurred from that rejection. And so the last point we can put in our book in the left column is that the child, Emmanuel, will serve as a sign to Judah of God's coming judgment for their unbelief. The child, Emmanuel, will serve as a sign to Judah of God's coming judgment for their unbelief. This is the context of the Emmanuel child of Isaiah 7 that Matthew has claimed Jesus fulfills this. Now let's fill out the right column. Let me now point out how Jesus fulfills the whole context of Emmanuel in Isaiah 7 and 8. And the theme that you're going to see here is what I said earlier. The events that happened in Isaiah's day are being repeated in the day of Jesus, but in a much greater way. And here's the first one, which will be the most obvious one to us. Remember that in Isaiah's day, the sign was that a young maiden, a young woman of marriageable age, will have a child and name him God with us. Well, look at how Jesus repeats that, but in a much greater way. In Jesus, a young virgin gives birth to a child who is literally God with us. A young virgin conceived a child who is literally God with us. Matthew sees a pattern here. Jesus is fulfilling everything that's going on in Isaiah 7 and 8, except in a much greater way. Because Mary isn't just a young woman of marriageable age who then has birth through Joseph. She's a literal virgin. Not only when she conceives Jesus, but if you notice at the end of Matthew chapter 1, in verse 25, Matthew makes it very clear that Joseph does not have relations with Mary even after she's married until she gives birth to Jesus. So when she gives birth to Jesus, she's still a virgin. So that's one way that Jesus repeats this pattern in a much greater way. But the second greater way that Jesus repeats the pattern is that He's not just a sign that God is with us. He is literally God with us. He's the embodiment of Yahweh. That's why you see Him in Matthew's gospel doing things that only God can do. The second way that Jesus fulfills this concept of Emmanuel from Isaiah 7 and 8. We had talked about how Emmanuel in Isaiah 7 is a sign of God's coming deliverance from the threat of Syria and Israel, as well as all the nations who would stand against God's people. But look at Jesus, how He's a greater part of this pattern. Whoops, hang on one second. There we go. Sorry, I hit it twice. Jesus will serve as a sign to His people, from 121, that God will deliver them from their sins. Jesus is a sign. Well, Jesus will serve as a sign to His people, as it's described in 121, that God will deliver them from their sins. Emmanuel of Isaiah 7 and 8 was a sign that God would deliver them from foreign armies. But in Jesus, we have the sign, Emmanuel, that we will be delivered from the greatest threat to God's people, which isn't foreign armies. It's not Rome. It's not whatever army might arise today. The greatest opponent of human beings is sin. That is the greatest threat to humanity. And Jesus is the Emmanuel who will be a sign that God will save them from that oppressor. Again, He repeats the Isaiah pattern, but in a much greater way. And then finally, one more, because we had talked about how Emmanuel was also a sign of judgment for the rejection of God as king. Because by and large, Judah and Ahaz, they will reject all this that Isaiah is saying. They'd rather turn to Assyria for help. But notice how Jesus also parallels this part of the pattern. Jesus will serve as a sign to the world of God's coming judgment for unbelief. Jesus will serve as a sign to the world of God's coming judgment for unbelief. Jesus is the new covenant Emmanuel. He is a sign that God is with us because He is a sign of God's deliverance. But as you keep reading Matthew's gospel, admittedly it's not here, or it's not explicit in Matthew 1:23, but if you know Isaiah, and Matthew refers back to Isaiah 7:14, you already know that, well, wait a second, Emmanuel was both deliverance and judgment. And you see that as you read Matthew's gospel. For even though Jesus comes and he gives deliverance to the people that put their faith in him, Jesus will simultaneously be teaching that those who reject his kingship have no hope. Their ultimate end will be judgment, which is one of the signs of Emmanuel in Isaiah 7 and 8. Again, Jesus repeats the pattern, but in a much greater way. And so let's just briefly summarize all this with this question. This question is in your book on all the other Old Testament quotations, but I forgot to add it to this one. So on page 15, you don't have this question there. If you want, you could just write it down at the bottom, but you will have this question for all the other quotations that we're going to look at in Matthew 1:1 to 4:17. Let's just summarize everything here with this question. What is Matthew telling us by claiming Jesus fulfills Isaiah 7:14? If you're like me, years ago, my answer to this would have been, oh, he's telling us that Jesus had to be born of a virgin. That's not wrong, but that's only one part of the answer. Matthew is drawing us to the entire context of Emmanuel in Isaiah 7 and 8. There's much more to the picture here than just Jesus had to be born of a virgin, and that means he was the Messiah. There's much more to it than that. Here's how I would answer this question that tries to capture everything that Matthew is wanting us to reflect on from the context of Isaiah 7 and 8. Jesus is the virgin-born Emmanuel, who is the sign of God's presence for both deliverance and judgment. Jesus is the virgin-born Emmanuel, who is the sign of God's presence for both deliverance and judgment. I would argue that that is what Matthew is getting across. It is the virgin conception and virgin birth, yes, but it's more than that. It's everything that Emmanuel meant in the context of Isaiah 7 and 8. Jesus repeats all of that in a much greater way. He is the ultimate Emmanuel sign to humanity, that God is with us, human beings, for both deliverance and judgment for those who reject his kingship. Now, let me just take 5 minutes here to make some applications, and then we'll be done. What can we take from all this? The first application I'll just mention very briefly. I just want us to see something. I want us to see this, because we're going to see this throughout. One application that I want us to take from this is that how Jesus fulfills the Old Testament is much more sophisticated than we typically espouse. Usually when we talk about Jesus fulfilling prophecies, all we really mean by that is the Old Testament made a prediction and then Jesus fulfilled that prediction. And what we don't realize when we say that or think that is that a good portion of the passages that New Testament authors claim Jesus fulfilled, they're not even forward-looking passages. They're not predicting anything. In Isaiah 7, there is a prediction. The child will be born, and before the child's old enough to know right from wrong, Syria and Israel will be gone. But notice in Isaiah 7 and 8, Isaiah's not talking about a child that's going to be born 2,000 years later. He's talking about a child born in that day. That's it's going to be a sign to King Ahaz. In Matthew chapter 2, Matthew's going to claim Jesus fulfills a passage that isn't even looking forward at all. It's looking backward at the Exodus. How can Jesus fulfill a passage that's looking backward? So what I want us to see today, and we're going to see all throughout, is that Matthew's concept of fulfillment, and all the New Testament authors' concept of fulfillment, is much more sophisticated than we typically will talk about or realize. And that's why I want to take time in this class to show that to us, so that we can get all the riches and depth of what Matthew is telling us about Jesus. Now, the next application is one more about ourselves. Here's something I would leave with us. One of the things that we can take from this is that God with us is both a comfort and a warning. God with us is both a comfort and a warning. When you read Matthew's gospel and you read Jesus, Emmanuel, God with us, rescuing people from sin, healing them of their diseases, casting out demons, it's a great comfort to us because God is with us. But the other side of that coin is that we got to recognize that Emmanuel from Isaiah 7 and 8 is also a sign of judgment. And you see that also in Matthew's gospel, where Jesus makes it very clear that those who reject His kingship will be judged by Him. He's the agent of that judgment. He's the Son of Man. And so God with us is both a comfort, but it's also a warning. Because God is with humanity. He's active in humanity for both deliverance and for judgment. And then finally, one more. As the fulfillment of God with us, Jesus is the ultimate sign that God fights for His people. As the fulfillment of God with us, Jesus is the ultimate sign that God fights for His people. That was part of the message of Isaiah 7. That Emmanuel, this child, was a sign that God would fight for His people. And in Isaiah 8, verses 9 and 10, God zooms out the lens and says, look, I'm going to give my people victory over all threats. Because God is with us. He fights for us. So as you read Matthew's gospel, read it as the story of God fighting for you. He's fighting for humanity. He's curing diseases. He's healing deformities. He's raising the dead. He's forgiving sins. He is fighting for human beings. That's how much God wants fellowship with human beings. And so if you get discouraged, if you feel discouraged over temptations that are hounding you, if you feel discouraged looking out at the world and seeing all the evil that just seems to be running rampant, remember that God has given you and me Emmanuel, the sign that He has already secured the victory for us because He's already fought for us and won. That's who Jesus is as Emmanuel. And so we've seen then today more of Matthew's themes, more of his claims about who Jesus is as the Christ, and we've seen how to read Matthew's gospel in light of the context of Isaiah 7 and 8, which Matthew refers us to in this passage. And so next week, we'll start examining Matthew 2, where he's going to build on his Christology in the story of the Magi and the wicked King Herod. So we'll start looking at that next Sunday. Thank you all so much. God be with you today.